Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have to make the usual announcement. If you've been to a movie lately or any other kind of a presentation, please remember to turn off your cell phones, which is I'm going to have to do too. Okey-doke. Welcome to FreeThought Fort Wayne's presentation of real journalism in the age of fake news, lying media, and alternative facts. I'm Robert Brandt. I'm the president of FreeThought Fort Wayne. If you would like to learn a little bit more about our group, we have some literature available over there that you can take. Sign-up sheets if you prefer, with some contact information. There will be an opportunity after the talk to ask some questions. Also, we have snacks and water over there, so if you'd like to stay afterwards for a while and just chat and socialize, well, I invite you to do that. Why this subject? We believe that several decades of attacks on the integrity of traditional media to obtain political advantage has eroded the trust and confidence of the public. Sponsoring this talk is an effort to help reestablish that trust and confidence by highlighting the education, training, and experience, and also ethical stance of professional journalism. Our guest speaker, Sherry Skufca, exemplifies the definition of professional journalism. She's been a reporter, and I'm sure she will probably enumerate some of her experience, so I won't go over that. I will only say that she's been the editor of the Journal Gazette since 1989. So it's my great honor to introduce Sherry Skufca. Please give her a warm welcome.
I don't usually do the podium thing, but it complicated things too much to wander tonight, so please do ask any questions you have. Actually, at any time, you won't distract me. I do need to correct one thing in the introduction. I've been in Fort Wayne since 1989. I came as the managing editor. Craig Klugman was the editor at the time, and I became editor last year when Craig retired. So I have been here for a long time, and I grew up about an hour from here in Northwest Ohio, so it was truly coming home to be here. I was asked to talk a little bit about what my path was into journalism, and it's not unlike most of the journalists that I know today. When I was growing up, I was going to be an astronaut. I was born in 1955, and I thought the space program was just about the coolest thing there ever was. I got glasses in the 2nd grade, and I cried for a week because that meant I couldn't be an astronaut. Never mind that I was also female at a time when there were no females at NASA, and I am as claustrophobic as anyone you'll ever run into. So if you've ever seen a Mercury capsule, you'll know that my time as an astronaut would have been very short-lived. So I decided if I couldn't be an astronaut, I was going to be Jules Bergman, which at least a few of you in here will probably remember as one of television's first space reporters. And I was so intrigued by his background and his knowledge and his ability to explain complicated things that I thought that's what I want to be. So, as I said, I grew up in a very small town in Northwest Ohio. There were 36 kids in my graduating class. When I got ready to go to college, it was 1973, and there were I think, 3 accredited journalism schools in Ohio. And one of them was Kent State. And my father said, no, that's not happening. So I chose to go to Bowling Green, in part because at the time, journalism was in the College of Business there. I don't think business really wanted us, but that's where we were, which meant I got to take a lot of economics courses, a lot of science courses as my electives. And so the one difference between me and probably a lot of journalists is that I came into the business able to read a budget. I came into the business not afraid of news and science, business news and science. And that has paid off handsomely as a reporter. If you can't follow the money, I don't care what you're covering, you're missing part of it. So I graduated from Bowling Green, went to worked for a couple of newspapers as a correspondent while I was in college. Went to work for the Newark Advocate, or NERC if you're from Ohio. You know it's always NERC. And that was my first experience with a chain ownership group. And after about 2 years, I decided that I didn't want to be in NERC anymore. I was a county government reporter, and that part of it was fun. But I moved with my husband to Tiffin, Ohio, and that was owned by a small family operation called Buckner News Alliance out of Seattle. And I was too young and too stupid at the time, too naive, to realize what a great ownership group that was. Our headquarters were in Seattle, Washington. They owned a bunch of small community newspapers around the country, and you saw them once a year. They came in to talk with you about your budget, and other than that, they left their newspapers alone. They believed that when times were hard, you invested, because then when things got better, you were ready to capitalize on it. I didn't realize, as I said, how truly unique that philosophy was for a number of years and a number of ownerships. And that's probably true for a lot of industries. There are people out there who believe in investing when things are tough, and that's always been my, if you keep digging a hole, the only thing you're going to get is a deeper hole. So I went from there to Southern California for a couple of years. One of my experiences that I'm most pleased with when I was still in Tiffin was a project called AT Videotex, and it was the forerunner of the internet. It was a service we put together. We gave the terminals away, and they were literally like, they're huge compared to laptops today. But I actually went into farm families in Northwest Ohio and programmed their modems. Any of you remember those loud things that you had to set the couplers into? I got to be pretty good at setting up wiring phones and setting up computers. And we ran that project for about 3 years to see what we could learn. And one of the things I learned is that, and I kind of knew this because my family has farmers in it, but anyone who uses the phrase dumb farmers has never really known a farmer. Because there is nothing dumb about people who play the futures market and literally bet every year on what they do. So it was a good, worthwhile project. Both Knight Ridder and Gannett were spending literally millions of dollars a year during the same period of time doing the same kinds of projects. And I'm happy to say we did it for a pittance of what they were doing. And if you compared our learning process, our learning reports from that, you will see that we learned exactly what they learned, only we did it for a lot less. Nonetheless, I moved to Southern California in the mid-'80s to take an editor's job. The first editors conference that I attended, there were 314 editors there, I think, and 7 of us were women. And I was told a couple of times in Ohio that the community wasn't ready for a female managing editor. So after the second time you hear that, you think, okay, well, it's not going to happen here. So we moved to Southern California, where they really didn't care. They just wanted someone who could get the newspaper out, and and lead a small group of reporters. And I was in Riverside County, which had, and still has, some of the best crime news you'll ever read. It's right on the edge of the desert. It's between there and Los Angeles. And it was a great 2 years. But after 2 years, and the best, maybe the best experience there was, even in the mid-'80s, that was a community that was very much Hispanic. There were, I would guess, almost as many Hispanic residents as there were, and Spanish-speaking residents as there were English-speaking as primary language. And that is an experience that I'm convinced everybody should have once in their life. They need to be in a community where they are in the minority, because it affects you in a way that you, no matter how in tune you think you are with the fact that others out there aren't like you, until you're actually in the minority in a community, I don't think you realize that. So I had a great 2 years. I couldn't stand the traffic. I couldn't stand planning my life around the freeway. And it was so expensive to live even back then. I think we had a small 2-bedroom apartment, and it was $900 a month back in 1985. It was just not sustainable for someone living on what a journalist makes. So I took an opportunity to go to York, Pennsylvania, which, if any of you have been there, it's just south of Harrisburg, near Gettysburg, part of Amish country. If you want to talk about a culture shock, to go from Southern California, where nothing was more than about 40 years old, to York, Pennsylvania, where if you weren't at least 200 years old, you weren't worth talking about, was a culture shock, but it was a good one. That was another opportunity to cover a community, and with the Amish, a community that really didn't want to be covered. But I had a good 2 years there. It was my first opportunity to manage in a union environment. I had not done that before, and I wanted to. And it was my first opportunity to work in features. As an editor in a features department, I was responsible for features, sports, and the opinion pages. And I had not done features, so it was a good opportunity for me to do that. And then when Fort Wayne opened up in 1989, my parents still live in Northwest Ohio. It was a JOA in a community that has a lot of media competition. And the one thing I don't think you'll ever find in a journalist is someone who shies from competition. The very nature of what we do kind of requires you to run on adrenaline. And so I came here, I interviewed. I told my husband it was the easiest interview I ever did because I liked what I was doing in York. And so I could come here, and if it worked out great, and if I didn't like them, I'd go back to York. And I met Craig, and I spent 2 days with the staff and looking at the town and the other media in the town, and I've been here ever since. I don't understand people who find Fort Wayne boring. I keep thinking they just need to get out more. This is not a boring community. This is a good news community. And so I have been here since 1989. Like I said, as managing editor, I was responsible for basically all of the staff and all of the pages of the paper except the editorial pages. And there is a very clear line in our newsroom between, and always has been, between the editorial staff and the newsroom staff. When I was managing editor, I didn't know what the editorial board was going to write about the next day, and they didn't know what we were doing. The editorial board here does its own reporting. They may occasionally talk to reporters, but for additional information or to get a source somewhere, but it truly is a wall between the two departments. And I think that is probably the healthiest thing you can find in a newsroom, because then the judgments being made on the news side are as divorced from the newspaper's editorial positions as is possible. I know we have readers who don't believe that, but it is still true. We made an exception last year to that wall, and we lowered the wall for our opioid project. We actually had joint meetings between one of the editorial page writers and our news staff, because that project we knew was going to be so big and take so many resources that I didn't see the need to do that twice. And so especially with the staffing the way it is now in most newsrooms around the country, we wanted to be as efficient as possible and still be thorough on that project. So we lowered the wall for that project, but other than that, it's still there. So, as I said, that's kind of how most, I think all of the journalists in my newsroom, whether you're talking about reporters, photographers, copy editors, there may be one exception, they're all college graduates. Most of them in either journalism or communications, but we have other options. We had, for a while, when Adams Center landfill was big, we hired someone with an environmental science background to cover that. People say you can teach folks to write if they understand the subject. You can, but it's painful. You can also teach writers to do research and learn their subjects, and I'm not sure that one of them is any more painful than the other. So what I like most about hiring journalism students is they have background, they have the history, they have the ethical background, they have at least some sense of what newspapers are supposed, or news organizations are supposed to do. And I thought it might be interesting to you to show you, one of the things Robert asked me about was about the Journal Gazette's ethics policy. Our ethics policy is 7 pages long. It was actually put together by the staff. Obviously, we got to check it out and make sure I was okay with it, but for the most part, it's basic constructs, and it's things like report the news accurately, thoroughly, and fairly, correct errors promptly, uphold free speech and freedom of the press, serving as a watchdog, seek solutions as well as exposing problems, conducting ourselves professionally, give subjects of news stories an opportunity to refute or discuss, and identify where our information comes from. And those are really the 7 guiding principles. Now, under professionalism, there's all kinds of other categories. My staff is not allowed to accept free gifts of any kind, for any reason. Most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, that's just genuine, not meant to try and bribe us or buy us. That's the woman who we wrote a story about her husband, and so she sends cookies, or the daughter who liked the story we wrote about her parents on their 60th wedding anniversary and sent us flowers. But it still creates a perception. My favorite story was, we did a story on Edie's Ice Cream. They were creating a new line, I think for Ben & Jerry's, if I remember right. And I got a phone call from downstairs that said, there's a box down here for you. Well, there's a box downstairs for the newsroom a lot of times. So I went to my next meeting. I didn't worry about getting down there. So by the time I got down there, it was 4:30. The box was a small ice cream case, and it was full of ice cream. Well, by this time, there's nobody at Edie's, because that's your first response, is to call the person back and say, gee, I'm glad you liked the story, but we can't accept this. The only person at Edie's at that time was a security guard, and he was not interested in letting anybody in. So we wrote a nice letter to Edie's, and I called them the next day as well, and said, I'm really glad you like this. Unfortunately, we can't accept gifts, so I hope it's okay that it made for a great dessert at the rescue mission. And that's what we do. We kind of have a list of places that you can take flowers and books and other things, and then we always get back to the respondent. And over the years, that has reduced the amount of free gifts we're getting. And again, you have to do it in a way that doesn't insult people, but the perception would certainly be, and there were parts of our building, I don't think that's true anymore, but there were parts of our building, like in advertising, where gifts were not a problem, but they definitely are in ours. Reporters can't take free tickets. They can't accept free meals when we go anywhere. And it's, again, more a question of the perception of a conflict of interest than it is the conflict, because once you lose your credibility, once someone can question that, then we're in trouble. So, one of the things that Robert asked me to talk about was fake news and this particular time that we're going through. I will tell you that I have had more fun. There is rarely a week that goes by that I don't get several phone calls, and usually more than that, from people that think we're not being fair to one side or the other. It always surprises them when I say, yesterday I got a phone call from someone who said we weren't being hard enough on Trump, and this will be somebody who thinks that we're being grossly unfair to him. First of all, I try to listen, because sometimes venting is, first of all, until they vent, they're not going to hear me anyway. But I also learn when they vent, so I learn what particular things they're concerned about, and usually in there is something that I can learn from. And then we explain why we do what we do. And sometimes that makes them happy, and sometimes it doesn't. I want to tell you what a great, I told you that I really, when I came to Fort Wayne, I was intrigued by the competition here. And I don't want to leave that without expanding on that. When I got into the business, when I got into the business in the 70s and 80s, there were, I think, at one time, 28 joint operating agreements, which, do all of you know what a joint operating agreement is? It's basically an exception to the federal antitrust laws that allow two newspapers to share circulation, press room, finance, human resources, but their newsrooms have to be separate. And in Fort Wayne, we have a JOA, and we've had one since the 1950s. We had one actually predated the law. And they are very separate. I think in the almost 40 years I've been in Fort Wayne, I have been in the News Sentinel newsroom twice. They have been in ours maybe the same amount of time, and it was always to borrow our conference room. We have people that are married to people in the other newsroom, and they meet in the hallway outside our newsroom. So it is very definitely two separate newsrooms. From the 28 JOAs that existed at one time, there are now 5. In most of those, the afternoon paper is usually the one that is the most vulnerable, has either been purchased by the morning or has just gone under. So it is a unique and very special situation that you have in Fort Wayne, where you have 2 independent newsrooms and 2 really different editorial boards and editorial philosophies. And that, I don't know the history of the News Sentinel as well as I do the Journal. I know in the Journal's case, that history goes back to at least the 50s, when the Journal Gazette was a proponent of civil rights and then women's rights, way before the rest of the country was. But one of my favorite stories to tell about Indiana is that the ERA passed here, and most people don't know that. And the current publisher of the Journal Gazette, her mother was one of the 2 people that went door to door and sold that. So in our case, the editorial philosophy of the Journal Gazette is, and has been, progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it, going back at least 60 years. So, like I said, I'm not exactly sure where the News Sentinel came from, but I suspect a similar kind of story. They were sold by Helene Follinger. It's been 50 years now, probably, first to Knight Ridder, and then to the current owners. Well, passed through another, but then to the current owners, who are based in Wheeling, West Virginia, Ogden newspapers. So, but our ownership group is still very much local, and it still very much reflects the Inskeep family editorial philosophy. So we have 2 newspapers in this town, which is very cool. Both of us have e-editions. Both of us have websites. Both of us have newsletters. We have social media presence on, we do, I can't speak for the News Sentinel, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So we're trying to reach as many people as we can. We have 4 local TV stations. We have 1 news radio station, plus PBS and NPR. This is a great community to have multiple sources of news. And probably the most depressing thing for me is when people don't use that, when they rely on just one source of news. It's like, I don't know why you would do that, and especially in a community as diverse as this one. Our situation is somewhat unique in that we were a strongly regional newspaper and still are a regional newspaper. So we have devoted resources to places that most of the other news outlets in our community don't have. We have a full-time Indianapolis Bureau reporter. Nikki Kelly lives at the State House during the session, literally lives at the State House during the session, and then covers the state courts and the other state agencies and writes enterprise for us. But she keeps a statewide view on things for us, and is a marvelous resource for local reporters who are writing about stories and might want to know how someone else is doing it. We also have in Brian Francisco a Washington reporter who 4 days out of 5 focuses specifically on Jim Banks, Joe Donnelly, our representatives for this area in Washington, D.C. and what they're doing. That is something that most newspapers our size do not have, and it is something that most of the other news organizations, none of the other news organizations in our community have. We think it's important. We think that what happens in Indianapolis, particularly in Indianapolis, but also in DC, affect us. And we also think if we don't do it, nobody else is going to. There is nobody else who's going to watchdog what's going on with our state or national representatives. And so, while I would love to throw another reporter at courts someday or another reporter at education some days, I think our watchdog rule requires that we put some of our resources in those 2 areas, and so we've continued to do that. The other things that are kind of unusual, we have a full-time business reporter in Sherry Slater, who covers everything including healthcare, in part from a business perspective. That's not a bad thing, especially in the current environment. One of the things that I've noticed over the 40 years I've been in this business is how much the focus has swung to economics. You can't talk about almost anything now without talking about what does it cost and what's the cost-benefit analysis, and that wasn't always true. I covered government at a time when that wasn't true. People said, does this make sense? Yes. Does the community want this? Yes. Would this be a good thing for our community? Yes. And so we did it. That doesn't happen anymore without cost-benefit talks, and maybe it never should have, but it's different. I wanted to just tell you a couple of things about journalists that you might not know. One is that the people that go into this business, I know everybody says if they go into a business, it's because they have a passion for it. I'm telling you, if you go into journalism, you have a passion for it. First of all, it takes a college degree to get in the door now. And it has for probably 30 years at least. So I have young graduates in my newsroom with significant college debt. I'm talking the kind that I had on my first mortgage. And they are graduating into jobs that start at about $26,000 a year. And for that, you work nights and weekends and holidays because we don't not publish. There are organizations that do. The News Sentinel works 6 days a week, but in our case, that's a 7-day-a-week commitment. I'm so relaxed. I just spent 2 weeks in Alaska, which has been my bucket list dream trip, on vacation, and for the first time in 40 years, was off the grid for 7 days. I have never been off the grid. I mean, even every other vacation I've ever taken, I knew what was going on. It was a bizarre experience to not know what was going on for 7 days. So they do it because, I think, for the same reasons I do it. It's cool to learn something new every day. And you really have to work to be in journalism and not learn something new every day. You get to read a lot of things every day. And most people in journalism love to read. You meet interesting people. And interesting does not necessarily mean celebrities or famous people. Some of the most interesting people that I have met, the ones that have stayed with me as a reporter and even as an editor, have been normal, everyday people grappling with a situation, good or bad, and they stick with you. And that's a really, really rewarding experience. Like I said, most of us are adrenaline junkies. For 39 of my 40 years, I came to work after 2 in the afternoon, and I worked until after midnight, and the press run was at the end of that schedule, so you just kept gearing up until the end of the night. So when you went home, you were like not ready to sleep till 4 or 5 in the morning. It's a little better now. I go in at 10 now, so it's a little bit different, but it's a business where your heart races a little bit, you pick things up. You can look around the newsroom, and if what's in the newsroom, when I hear a fire call for a water rescue, if what's in the newsroom is a sports reporter, you don't get an argument when you say, Greg, I need you to go. It's a great business where the people in it actually like the news they do. And it's a great opportunity to meet people. Even the people that call me and are yelling at me, I'm learning stuff from their customers, but they're also members of the community. And I don't think you can be in journalism and not be a member of the community. You can be a member of the community, you can't be a member of groups. You can't protest, you can't sign petitions, you can't have bumper stickers on the back of your car. The politics and the social activities that many of us do. In fact, that's the most common thing I hear when people retire is, now I'm going to do all those things for the last 50 years I've wanted to do. And you will find some very active retirees from journalism newsrooms, but not while they're doing it. So that is the part that I prepared. I have lots of other notes, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
You need me to field those, or?
Not unless you want to.
Well, I'm going to pull rank.
All right.
I'll get the first one. As an editor, you're responsible for deciding what stories to place in the paper, where to place them, what emphasis to give them, and so forth. There's some people, we went to the get-together at IPFW on Monday, which dealt with fake news and so forth. It was had Lisa Ryan from NPR, Morning Report, Morning Edition, and there wasn't unanimity as far as what fake news and was all about. In general, however, from the making up something that was absolutely false in order to make a point, to shading whatever is going on, generally fell into that category. It was more or less like propaganda. A lot of people could accuse newspapers of using their editorial capability to emphasize one thing over another. So how do people maintain trust, if, like some of the people calling you, think that you're being too kind to one or too tough on the other, and that sort of thing?
That's a really good question, and the part of the reason that journalists struggle with the term fake news is because it's been here forever. If you look at the history of journalism and the era of yellow journalism, there's nothing brand new about it. There are, however, some insidious there's some parts of it that are especially insidious right now. One of them is, and this is very much different, and it's the one that frankly keeps me up at night, because I do believe that eventually truth will win out. Not everyone will hear it and accept it, but I do believe eventually truth wins out. So the person that repeats a lie and repeats a lie in order to try and convince people that it's the truth, eventually, for people that are paying attention, they'll pick up on that. What is more insidious to me, and this is a huge growth industry, is the growth of the public relations, spin doctor, PIO. They come under a number of different titles. That is a huge growth in just the years that I've been in this business. And they're not, most of the time, they're not lying, but they're spinning. And some of them are really, really good at it, and some of them are really, really good at it because they've hired journalists to do it. Most journalists get a pretty good pay raise when they go into public relations. So what concerns me is, and I don't mean to malign the public information officer for the police department or the public information officer for the Fort Wayne Community Schools. Like I said, many of them just do a good job of doing their jobs. But when you see industries hiring public relations firms for hundreds of millions of dollars a year in order to spin, I think the last one I saw a number on was the fracking issue. And you can see it on both sides of it, but it's usually the companies, the industries that have the money to award the big bucks. When they start releasing information, and sometimes it's released by the public relations agency, which at least is easy to tell, but sometimes it gets released under, Citizens for Cleaner Energy. And it sounds like a good thing, and so it appears to be a trustworthy and good source for something, and it's really a mouthpiece for, and I made that one up, so that's not a general one. But those people concern me the most because I don't know how there are too many of them for any one, for the newspaper industry, for example, or the TV industry, if it were so inclined, to out all of those when it happens. And so it just kind of insidiously gets into the mainstream, and you start sharing, your Facebook friends start sharing stories about this group or that group, and I don't know how you get around that. I really don't. There are some schools that are attempting right now to do more critical media classes. Most of them are running into brick walls with parents who have their own political philosophies, and so when you start trying to explain to kids how you can, well, then one side or the other thinks it's, so I don't know where that learning happens. What I've advised the college classes that I've talked to and the high school classes I talked to is access a lot of different information sources. It's one of the things we do. We have the Associated Press Wire Service. We also have the Washington Post Bloomberg Wire Service, and we have the Tribune News Wire Service. So on the Manchester explosion, we probably had 100 different stories to look at to decide which one was going in our newspaper. And when we're looking at it, we're looking for things that are unique in a story, so the exclusive part, who has the best sources. But we're also looking for what sticks out, what information here doesn't seem, nobody else has it, and it doesn't ring true. It doesn't feel right. There's no, I don't know where it came from. The source isn't there, or the source is someone I don't know. And we're gonna be, Associated Press has always said, if we have to be last, we'll be last, but we're gonna be right. And if you're sitting in our newsroom and you're waiting for a body count, or you're waiting on, you're going, okay, get it right, but get it here. We're kind of the same way. If there's something out there that just doesn't feel right, then we're gonna pass on that story and use one of the other wire service stories to get it in there. So when we meet at 4 o'clock every day, and the public is invited to attend a news budget meeting if you really wanna see how sausage is made, we will meet. I will have about a dozen people in the room. So we'll have features editors, sports editors, photographers, copy desk, the news editor for that night, the Metro staff, of course. And we'll throw out, today I think we had 8 stories on the list for page 1. And we got 4 on, which is pretty standard. And today, all 4 happen to be local. That's not usually true. There's usually a mix of wire and local, but we had 4 good local stories. But anybody in that room can say, why are we putting that story there? Why isn't that a Metro story? Or why are we burying this story? And so, and that group has a nice mix of age and experience, and as well as some racial mix, gender mix. So it's a good group to have thinking about things. So it's not just one person. I usually wait until I've heard from the others before I weigh in with what I think we ought to do. But it's a good group, and I trust them, and we've worked together for a long time. So like I said, we use a lot of sources. We don't use anonymous sources, very, very rarely. The Washington Post does occasionally. My rule of thumb on that is that the first time we get burned by an anonymous source, whether it's a local person or a wire service, because their credibility is on the line with us, then we don't use them, because we can't afford to do that. So if you ever want to come, it lasts about 20 to 25 minutes. Yesterday we had a nice, neat little plan when we left the meeting, and 2 hours later the whole thing was up in the air, and I think we used one of the stories that we had planned on. But we can take breaking news up until about 11:30 or 11:45 and still make our print edition. Yes?
Yeah, I thought you might add a little bit of information that you know about when you're talking about the public information officers, and especially in big business that are trying to spin a lot of information. What comes to mind for me is our organizations like Monsanto, who literally puts their documents into government legislative agendas and so forth, but also
They actually write some of the bills.
yeah, there you go. But also what I've noticed that I think must be pretty prevalent is when I go on blogs that are industry or topic specific and people are asking questions, that there are experts from that industry that are pretending to be regular people that are engaging as if, they're adding something to the conversation on that level, when actually they're trying to spin it in this blog. It's quite scary sometimes, because you don't know how much of that's going on.
Right, and like I said, to me that's the most insidious part of the whole thing, because there is so much of it, and it doesn't matter what industry you pick. They've all discovered the value of paying people that are good to place stories. And like I said, a lot of times the information that they're placing isn't wrong, it just isn't incomplete. And so we will, the reporters will ask more questions. And it's not unusual to have those questions not answered.
Well, and in this case, there's no reporter there, you know.
Exactly.
You know, if you don't critically think and understand that this person, you know, is saying something totally different than you've read other places, and they're way too good at what they say.
And again, that's the importance of reading more than one source and not stopping at. And the stuff that gets shared on Facebook is scary, because if the way the Facebook groups, or cliques as I call them, have set themselves up, and I have family members and friends who are in certain cliques and have certain philosophies, and once one of them shares it, and then it gets picked up by 25 other ones, suddenly it's out there in a form in so many other circles that there's no way to call it back. So even if you blow the whistle on it and say, you know, I know for a fact that that's not true, and this is where the information is that'll prove that, you know, sometimes you'll get back a thank you, but usually you'll get back, well, it could be. It's like, I don't know how to respond to that. When the truth is right there in front of you, and you still don't want to accept it, I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, a lot of that comes from the bots, isn't that what they call it, the electronic way of...
Some of it does,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's definitely a very sophisticated, it's developed into a very sophisticated medium. And I'm sure that if you had someone from public information firm here, they would tell you that we're all worried about nothing. But I see it every day. I probably get 400 emails every day, and now anymore, probably 300 of those will be from PR agencies of one kind or another. So,
Oh.
yes.
My biggest problem, I guess, when I read the newspaper, there's this tendency to balance. Here's one side, here's the other side. And a lot of times the other side is crap, but they'll report it anyway. And no one says it's crap. I mean, at some point, why do you have to have, you say, this is the fact, and somebody else says, well, what if? And I guess, when do you decide to say, you know, we're only going to present what we know, and this is crap?
There's an interesting discussion out there right now about fake news versus free speech. And for most journalists, there's nothing more important than free speech. So I might hate fake news, but the right of people, even to lie and to repeat a lie, if that's what they choose to share with their friends. So I think the idea of trying to find people that balance a story, or create fairness in a story, is to try and find people who, and what we're trying to find are people who can make a cogent, intelligent argument for the other side. And sometimes we can't find them, or we don't find them. But that's what we're looking for. Because the truth of the matter is, based on your perspective and what your life experience is and what your interests are now, you could legitimately be on the other side of something that I think sounds like a great idea. And so we want to present as many intelligent, rational sides as we can. What I have enjoyed in my short year on the editorial board is that that's a place where we can say bullshit. I mean, that's a place where the editorial board can say, no, this was crafted, I know what they're saying, but this was crafted with this in mind. This is why it's a good idea or a bad idea. This is what you can do about it. And I've really, really enjoyed freeing up that part of my brain to take part in that. It's also a place where we present the other side, though. Our op-ed page is, and one of the things that I love about this community is we get regularly, maybe not daily, but close, locally written opinion pieces that many times we don't agree with, but we run them on our opinion page because others out there do. We get all the letters to the editor that we can publish. In fact, we had to set a rule that you couldn't write more than one letter every 30 days because we had people who would write to us every day. So there's plenty of opinion on those pages. And that's where I usually send people when they say, but you don't ever cover, I'll say, you need to pay more attention to our editorial pages because there's all kinds of diversity of opinion there. And that is rare. Fort Wayne should be very, very proud of that because when I talk to editors in other communities, they're lucky if they get a couple of submissions a month. And like I said, the next time you read our paper, when you read our Sunday paper, just look at how much local stuff is in the perspective section. It's terrific.
The problem I'm seeing is, especially with young kids and stuff, they have trouble discerning between opinion page and the factual stories.
And it's not just young kids.
Yeah.
We have that discussion regularly with readers, and that has to be part of my industry's fault. That has to be part of our fault, that we haven't done a better job of educating people to what's in the different parts of the paper and where you go to look for it. And when you think about it, it shouldn't be rare. As newspaper readership has declined, and we're actually being accessed by as many homes or more than we ever were now because people just go to our website. But as newspaper readership has declined, the print product has declined here and elsewhere, kids aren't growing up in homes where mom and dad read the paper. They're not growing up in homes where they watch that happen or they watch them discuss something or they know. So I guess it shouldn't surprise me that they can't distinguish when they, especially if they're accessing us online. We try to be really clear about what our opinion pages are and what our editorials are, but I think we could have done and could do a better job of that than what we're doing. I think you're absolutely right about that.
How would someone go about getting a positive response in interest from a reporter to the Journal Gazette?
We take story submissions, I said about at least 300 to 400 come from public information or PR agencies. I'm thrilled whenever I open a locally written email with someone with a story idea. We can't always get to all of them, but you can send it to me, you can send it to our, depending on what the story is, you can send it to our Metro editor, but we're always interested in what's out there. We have a number of feet on the street and our people try to stay involved, but there's no way they can know all the stories that are out there. As they say, there's a story in every person, and most of them just never get told, and in some cases that's really sad.
When you get a story from down the wire, so to say, from Associated Press or somebody, does the Journal Gazette ever just publish that story, or is it always, you get several sources and you rewrite it from maybe more of a community impact perspective? Or
No, we most of the wire service stories that we run as they were written. Now we may localize some, we may drop boxes into some. Brian Francisco frequently drops in how our senators and representatives voted on a particular bill. We'll just drop a couple paragraphs in a story, but most of the time those stories run unedited, other than for space. The Washington Post writes way more on a topic than anyone, including me, would want to read, so they do get edited for space. Yes?
First of all, I also moved back, so know how when you tell people we have 2 newspapers, other friends that live around the country, they all just go, oh wow, and so that's one of the reasons to come back. I'm glad you brought up the yellow journalism because that didn't get brought up the other night. And one of the things that bothers me is that we don't remember that knowledge of that's the way that journalism was. And we had papers taking us to war, which we've had also recently. But do you see any difference in, your post-Watergate, where I think we had this new resurgence of understanding how important the press was to us? because what bothers me, I guess I'll get to what bothers me is, in addition to the insidious thing you said, we now have this thing called the mainstream media, that constantly people are using that as a buzzword to invalidate journalism and, you know, respected journalism. And to me, those two together are what we worry about, because people, what we can't forget about the fake news is this time, if someone had a deliberate intent for, for fake news, it wasn't just to do something so you would, you know, on Facebook make something, there was an intent. The intent was to interfere with our election, where this came from. I think that's understood as part of it. So where do you see this going, or what is the talk among you people in journalism about this? You know, I hear it all the time, which is it's like a dismissal. You know, it's as if
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. And it's your fake news, which is exactly not what the definition of fake news is, because there has to be an intention to deceive.
I just saw a Gallup poll study today that said among, I forget, 10,000 Republican voters that they did, 14% said they trust the mainstream media.
What do we,
14%.
Who do they trust?
Out of 32%.
What do
Well,
we
what
do
I
about
haven't figured out is why they don't see Fox as mainstream media,
Yeah.
because
they are.
I don't know how you define mainstream media that doesn't include them. So if you have them in the mix, and I watch on a daily basis, I probably watch or listen to, because it's on in the background, probably listen to CNN a little bit more than the others. But I make it a point every day to spend time with Fox, with BBC, with MSNBC, although I spend less time with that than I do with the other two. Because I want to hear where this stuff is coming from, and eventually some of that stuff will percolate into the others. So I don't understand. What concerns me the most is that we are seeming as a society, and you can have all of this stuff in the media playing out that you want to. I was very much aware of Watergate. I was in high school at the time, and I've seen, I mean, I remember Dick Nixon, he hated the press, and he took regular swipes at it. So that part of it is not new. The amount of it is new, and what's very different, and I grew up in a household, I doubt if my father's voted for a Democrat in his life. If he has, it was a truly exceptional one. I watched what happened with Nixon on my father, the effect of that on my father, and he was angry, he was betrayed, he was. I don't see that today. I see people setting up almost like fan clubs
Right.
for whatever their political position is, and they're not listening to the other side. They're not open to hearing anything. They're not open to discussing anything. It's like you're either with me or you're evil.
Yes.
You're either with me or you're more than wrong. You're deliberately trying to, and I don't know how you get past that, because that's the answer to fake news. The answer to fake news is that the people digesting it say, okay, this is crap. And I'm going to keep talking to my uncle or my cousin or my father, or who has dramatically different views than I do. But I don't see that happening. I see friends breaking up. I see relatives who don't talk to each other anymore over this stuff. I don't know how you get to that, except to keep trying, to keep knocking on the door and keep trying.
Wasn't that the point, the overall?
I don't know if it was. I don't know if, Craig used to say, our old editor used to say, never attribute to evil purposes what is just plain ass incompetence, or, and so
too much credit.
Too much credit.
I'm not sure if that's what they set out intending to do, or if they set out intending to have this big of a scope.
Yeah.
It certainly suits people's power right now, to have some of the positions out there that are being flaunted. I don't know what the answer is. I know that I did see, on a heartening note, I saw a story the other day that said, in spite of what you read, young people are not adverse to reading newspapers. they may be reading them online, but the average age, and that's a good thing, because at least they're getting another source of news in there. The New York Times and Washington Post have not had a circulation this high in, I forget how many years, but I mean, their circulation has gone right through the roof. One of the things that ought to concern us, though, is the newspapers that are growing and the news organizations that are growing are all on the East Coast or the West Coast. There's everything in the middle of the country is shrinking, and TV stations are going out of business there, newspapers are going out of business there. So the sources of information that those people have about the things that affect them on a daily basis, either locally or at a state level, even at a state level, it's scary. That I don't know how you come back from. That's going to be a difficult one to solve, because if you've ever had, when you've watched even the flood here in '82 when Reagan was here, or other national stories, you know, when the national media comes in, they're here for one thing, they parachute in, they parachute out. They're not here to cover you, they're here to cover whatever that situation was. I was still a pretty young reporter when 3 Mile Island happened. And I got called to come out and cover 3 Mile Island, read a newspaper 12 miles from there. And when the editor called, he said, everybody I have who has kids has left. Would you be willing to come out and help us cover this? And I said, yeah, I'm 10 hours away, I'll be there tomorrow morning. It occurred to me as I'm driving to Pennsylvania that there is, I think the road at the time was 2 lanes in both directions, the interstate. They were using the berms, and there were 4 lanes coming at me, of just constant cars. There was absolutely no one on my side of the road. I could stop at any rest area I wanted to. Didn't have any lines to wait for the bathrooms. But I saw some of the ugliest national media covering 3 Mile Island, because we would be there for, I think I was there for almost 2 weeks. And these national media would helicopter in, ask the same questions that we had been asking for 3 days. So now we're covering it again for another time, instead of getting to the stuff we really wanted to talk about and wanted to go the next level on. And then it was, I still remember one reporter from a national TV station who said, I did my spot, get me the hell out of here now. And it was like, okay. So when you're growing and basic information sources are on both coasts, and you don't have that core of people that understand Kansas, that understand Nebraska, that understand Indiana, keeping an eye on it, that's a problem.
I've noticed on cable news, but the cable news channels like in MSNBC, CNN, every hour or 2 hours, you get the same news over again with another person there to talk about it, but it's the same, not crap, but it's the same.
It's usually
stuff.
even the same video clips.
Yeah.
It's always breaking news.
Yeah, and it's always breaking news or news alert and that kind of thing. And I keep wondering, is there anything new here other than that? Can't you go on to something else? There's lots of stuff going on.
Once they platoon their reporters, wherever they've determined the major stories of the day are, it's not as simple as just picking them up and moving them somewhere else. And that's where print media still has a pretty large advantage, because we have more people on the street, and newspapers will, through the Associated Press, which is a co-op, the members of the newspapers who take the Associated Press contribute to it. And so I don't have to be in Kansas to know what's going on in Kansas. I can trust the Associated Press report from there. So there's a much better web or network of reporters on a print scale to do that than there is TV. And it's frankly a lot easier for a print reporter to get somewhere. It's basically him and a network or him and a notebook or her and a smartphone, and you've pretty much got everything that you need for print and internet to cover. TV's got to take stuff.
Gotta get the picture.
They got to get the picture. So it's a lot more difficult for them. And they're also, I mean, if we have a slow time in local news for our website, we can update our Facebook pages, we can run more feature stuff, we can pull more stuff off the wire. When they're doing network news, particularly when they're doing cable news, they're 24/7. And so they're stuck, they gotta fill the airwaves, and so what you see are the repeats. I still go to sleep, and I have ever since the first Iraq war. I've gone to sleep every night with CNN on in the background. And it's amazing how quick you get it, hearing those tones and knowing when it's time to wake up and pay attention. But most of the time, you just sleep really well, because there's nothing new going on. Nothing new going on. Yes?
There's been some consolidation in the media world,
Mhm.
companies buying up other companies. Is that happening in the local level, like it is happening with the major?
We've certainly seen it in the TV world, where Indiana's News Center bought Channel 33, and then Granite sold, and I think Wayne has even changed ownership groups. So you've definitely seen it in the TV market. The Journal Gazette has stayed, like I said, it's locally owned, and it's stayed locally owned since 1863. So we have not been affected by that. The News Sentinel's been sold 3 times since I've been here. The bigger concerns I think most people express are what happens when Gannett keeps buying newspapers, or another media conglomerate keeps buying newspapers or TV stations. And that's a legitimate concern, but as if the ownership is at all committed to newspapers, and one of the things that we've been very pleased with the News Sentinel's sale is that it was sold to a newspaper company. So it wasn't sold to a group of investors. Now, they also own part of the Pirates, and they own part of a resort, and they own parts of different other businesses, unlike the Journal Gazette company. But they are first and foremost a news information company. And so even when you disagree on how money should be spent, or even when you disagree on other things, they're coming at it from a different angle than those publicly traded investment company-owned media outlets. And they're in trouble, because frequently their ownership group does not see a value in people on the street. I actually was at a conference once where I heard somebody say, "We fill the space around the ads." Now, if that's your approach to newspapering, you're not in a community that's served very well. You don't have that issue here.
Sherry?
Yeah.
I think we have maybe time for one more question.
Okay.
If we have one?
Yes.
Yeah, earlier you used the word phrase, good news community. Can you expand on that as far as to what how you define this community?
That's a great question. It's large enough that it has, and it has more diversity in it than people expect. So when I say good news community, I don't just mean if it bleeds, it leads. Yes, we have our fair share of crime stories and sensational stories that we don't have to do any work to make them sensational. If you followed the trial this week, and the murder trial, that was just fine all by itself. People tell us that that's not what they want to read, that we need to do more good news stories. I will tell you that's not what they read.
Right.
That may be true, but that's not what they read. When I say good news, though, I don't mean just that we have those kinds of stories. We also have a growing community, which means that there are more stories to write than I can get to on things like the riverfront and the Arena project and the GE. We just sent Sherry Slater to Durham to look at the A.J. Reynolds campus down there with the same developer that's going to be working here. I would love to have sent 3 people down there and a photographer. So we have growth, and if you've ever lived in a community that doesn't grow, whether it's annexation or it's economic development or it's new businesses, if you're living in a town that's shrinking, and there are tons of those in our circulation area, those are not good news towns, because there's nothing happening in those towns. People are trying to hang on to what they've got, and there's just not a lot to write about. Whenever you're growing your fire department, your police department, your parks department, then you've got lots of quality of life stories to write about. We have the zoo, we have the library, we just have a ton of stuff in this community that we could cover every day if we chose to and tell a different story. And so when I talk about a good news community, that's what I'm talking about. Some of the stories are not going to be good news. Some of them are going to be crime stories. And the opioid project, that was not a good news project. But we started to see that show up we were seeing it in our courts coverage, of course, and in our police coverage, but we were also hearing it on the fire thing when the EMTs were being sent out. We were seeing it in the schools. We were seeing the increase in foster care, the need for foster care parents. So we were seeing it in a lot of different places. And that's why we decided to devote 6 months to tell people that have not had a firsthand experience with that yet. And I don't think, unfortunately, that we've hit the worst of that yet. What's out there? And, 2 of my favorite parts of that story, one of them was in the very first break of the story, was the 70-year-old woman who was on painkillers and was dependent on them, because when people in our community heard opioid overdose or heard opioid crisis, they were not thinking of a 70-year-old employed mom and grandmother who didn't have any other way to deal with it but these painkillers. And those are the kinds of stories, I think, when we can put those in perspective for people. I mean, as a community, we still have to decide what we're going to do about it and how much we want to do with it and how we're going to attack it. But until somebody spells it out and I think helps people see it, if they're not experienced with it, you don't get a chance to do that. So for better or worse, Fort Wayne has an opioid crisis, and it still has a meth crisis. And all you had to do was look at the map we ran with the opioid project and the dots on there to see where the overdoses was, to realize that it's in every community in our city. There is not a subdivision that hasn't been exposed to it. So that's what I mean by good news community.
Thank you very much.
I do have some business cards over here. If anybody wants to pick them up, I would love to hear from them. And like I said, if you ever decide you want to watch the sausage being made, just do that call. We'll get you an extra budget printed out and you're good for it.
I just with some expertise as far as how do you work the microphone, that sort of thing. Also to Norm Compton and Access Fort Wayne, who has been recording the talk and will rebroadcast it hopefully on the Access Fort Wayne channels. If you have, I guess, Fios and Comcast. I don't know, I got DirecTV, so I'm out of luck. Anyway, watch out for it. Also, in particular, to you, the attendees who came out to learn more about a very important subject. Appreciate you coming here, and most of all, of course, to Sherry Skufca, who provided us with a very entertaining and informative talk. So thank you again, Sherry. We have some cookies, we have some water, there's some literature that you can take a look at, and a little bit of time for socializing and chatting if you'd like. So, thank you again.